An unpopular opinion about George Carlin. Recently, I decided to listen to some of his stand-up routines. And as a creative, I felt that there was some strange duplicity going on with him. I learned through listening to him being interviewed. First, he was interviewed by an XM radio host. Then he was also interviewed by Jon Stewart. When Jon Stewart was first starting out, I discovered that he actually grew up in privilege. Despite the fact that he only grew up in a one-parent household, his father was an advertising exec, and his mother was a secretary for an advertising executive. So presumably, his father and mother met at the advertising firm that they both worked at. She left him, though, when George Carlin was an infant. By the time he was 10 years old, he had announced to his mother and to his brother, who's 5 years older than him, and to his school that he wanted to be an actor. And so they set everything in motion for that to happen. So again, he was born in the silent generation where things were done a little bit differently in this country back then than they are now. And probably it was the last generation, actually the baby boom generation was the last generation that was basically handed a meritocracy and handed privilege and opportunity that all generations that followed, starting with the most scapegoated generation in history, which is mine, Generation X, we're not handed that same meritocracy, and we're not handed that same opportunity for to follow, your own path and do what you wanted in life. So at age 10, in 1947, George Carlin announced to anybody who would listen that he wanted to be an actor. So his mother bought him some expensive equipment at the time in order for him to record his stand-up bits. Every time she threw a dinner party, she would bring out her little pet Georgie and say, okay, do your little stand-up bit for all the guests. And so he had all sorts of opportunity to practice. The nuns at his school would expose him to all the right kind of things that he needed to be exposed to in order to cultivate his talent. They supported him in any of the plays that he was in throughout school. So this is a kid that was handed every opportunity and handed every means of support in order to go after the thing that he said he wanted to do at age 10. How many 10-year-olds now in the 21st century that come up and say, I want to do this or I want to do that, are given that same opportunity? Hardly any, if any at all, unless you're born into wealth. So by the time George Carlin was 19 or 20 years old, he was handed his own radio show in Shreveport, Louisiana. And when he was interviewed by the XM radio host to talk about his life and his success and his career and his family and all that, the XM radio host actually played the introductory bit to the George Carlin radio hour back in the early 1950s or the mid 1950s or so from that radio show in Shreveport, Louisiana that he was given by the radio station's owner. And I swear to God, he looked really uncomfortable because imagine it being, the 1950s in fucking Shreveport, Louisiana. I mean, look, George Carlin was born into privilege. He was born into opportunity. He had everything handed to him his whole life. I can't imagine that his radio hour was, pure as the driven snow. I'm sure that he had some off-color remarks, because if you look at his later work, he goes after everybody. He goes after yoga mothers. He goes after guys named Todd. I mean, he says the most violent off-color remarks about just average people that live in the United States. He says some really violent things towards them, and I find that's kind of like low-hanging fruit. As a as a creative, as that doesn't really do much for your artistry and for your work. It wasn't until later on in his career, much later on as he got older, that he started talking about class divide, that he started, really talking about how, you know, if you're not sitting at the table, then you're what's for dinner, kind of thing. That's, I think that's one of his famous lines, where he talked about how government is nothing but corruption, how your vote doesn't matter, how the cops aren't there to help serve, protect you, and all that stuff. I mean, he goes on and on and on about stuff that really resonates with us as leftists. But he doesn't come from a place where he's ever felt the sting or the pathos of that experience. He's just talking about it as an outsider. Because he's never been poor, he's never gone hungry, he's never known how he was going to pay his electrical bill. He's always had a Christmas, he's always had, a holiday. He had 3 heart surgeries in his lifetime, so like many wealthy people that can have multiple surgeries, I mean, the Rockefellers or the Rothschilds get, multiple heart transplants throughout their lifetimes. You know what I'm saying? No normal person could afford multiple heart surgeries. He comes from, and he comes out of a meritocracy and an opportunity in that particular generation, which was held as an important value mark of society. That's not something we have now. Unless you're born very wealthy, unless you're born into a class system that, where, your kids can have access to higher education, and your kids can have access to, waking up one day at 10 years of age and going, yeah, so I want to be a comedian and I want to be an actor, and have an entire network of people to put all of the things in place in order for that to happen. If you're born into that privilege and you still like Carlin, then of course you're never going to understand where I'm coming from, because I wasn't born into that. I wasn't born into that level of support. I wasn't born into that support system. I didn't have access to that meritocracy. And there's a couple of other things that I wanted to mention too about, in general, about people who seem to come out of nowhere, that gain a lot of popularity in a very short span of time. I'm going to bring up a podcaster that I used to listen to. Really just a personality, just a person who, like George Carlin, could really amp up your emotions and really get you emotionally involved and invested in her work and in her rantings and her, her hour-long Facebook Live feeds and things like that, her YouTube messages. And this is somebody who goes by the name of Sane Progressive, and her real name is Debbie Lusignan. Well, she started her live feeds on Facebook and her YouTube channel and all that stuff right about the same time that many of us did, which was during the 2016 election. What was happening throughout 2016, especially through the election process, was there were a lot of inconsistencies and a lot more questions kept coming up as a result of fraudulent activity being done through, like, the voting system. And next thing you knew, like, the onions were being peeled, and we found layer upon layer upon layer of information that was just proving to us that we don't live in a functioning democracy, that we don't live in a functioning society. It's a very dysfunctional society where the people, the underclasses, in this community of civilization in the United States, don't really have a say in what the corporate entities that run our government are telling us that this is how we should be living. I mean, we don't really have a say. We don't have any power. We're not part of this conversation. And so Debbie Lusignan, as Sane Progressive, came up out of nowhere. And from the time that she started until the time she ended, her popularity grew so fast and so quickly. And yet ours stagnated. We were saying the exact same things. We were going live on Facebook just like she was. We started a YouTube channel. We attempted to offer some insight and creativity and some intellectual dialogue into a system that has seemed to lose its its head. There was so much craziness going on. We were trying to insert a little bit of enlightenment and intellectual dialogue into this crazy making system that we had all discovered was really controlling everything. And JP, my husband, would get really frustrated because he would say, why is it that this chick over in Massachusetts has got 30,000, 50,000, 80,000, 100,000 followers, and we're stagnating at 200 on our Facebook page and only 300 on our YouTube page? What the fuck are we doing wrong? So I did a little investigation. And this is where that concept of a built-in audience for these seemingly popular people that sort of get popular out of nowhere, like George Carlin, for instance. So like George Carlin, Debbie Lusignan had a built-in audience. In her small town in Adams, Massachusetts, she had run for office, and she got somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 votes for the position that she was campaigning for. Not only that, she grew up in a small town where she never left it. She has, multiple homes in her name. She has family that supports her. It's one of those towns where everybody knows her. So we're talking a town of thousands of people. Then we're talking about, she ran for office and got 30 to 40,000 votes. So when she decided to go live on Facebook and create this platform called Sane Progressive, she already had a built-in audience of, I'm estimating, about 50,000 people. So when I explained that to JP, he was like, oh, so she really didn't come out of nowhere. She had like a built-in audience. She had a lifetime of support from her community. Now she has a story about how she grew up poor and how she got pregnant and had to live in a shack. I mean, that's really dubious to me for someone who came from privilege and for someone who the entire town knows her name. And she ran for office. I have no doubt that at some point in her life, maybe she went through troubled times, but I don't know if I truly believe this, this story about how she had to live in a shack with no heat with 2 little children to care for. I mean, come on. So it's the same thing with Carlin. I mean, so he grew up in this, environment where he had an entire school supporting him to go into his acting career. He had a mother who was fairly well off for being a single mother. She was a secretary for years for an executive, so she made good money. And at the time, he was 10 years old in 1947. At the time, a woman could own her own home. Chances are the father doled out a little bit of money here and there. I mean, to support her and the kids. And he had a relationship with his mother that I would say was very similar to what many antisocial, well-off types in San Francisco have with their parents, where their parents consider them their pets and they perform for the dinner guests, and they grow up to be these really coddled, socially jilted, or socially stunted, not jilted, socially stunted people who don't really know how to behave appropriately in society. There's a lot of those types in San Francisco. They're just, and George Carlin he could have gone that way. He could have been like this perpetual mama's boy. He was her youngest child. He was, used as a prop for her dinner parties. He had this really sort of, it sounded like, as he was describing it, it kind of sounded a little incestuous. He did everything to please her, and he admits freely that she was very controlling. I mean, this is somebody who could have grown up to be one of those highly dysfunctional males that would never get married and could never really find anybody because it would never be good enough for his mother. But instead what he did is he latched on to an idea, and I'm sure that this idea did not come from himself. He latched onto this idea to start attacking various people in society in the same way that these antisocial types who are, really manipulated by their parents and especially by their mother in the same way that they do. And today we call them incels. But what George Carlin did is he took this really toxic behavior towards an attitude towards society, and he used it in his stand-up routine. And eventually it turned into toxic vitriol towards the state and towards the government and towards the class divide and all the things that it should be launched at, right? All the things that toxic attitude should be launched at. So it worked out, I guess, in the end, but it took some evolution and some going through some different fields of study, so to speak, in order to get him to that place. And also, I really want to drive home the fact that he had a built-in audience. By the time he was, 19 or 20 years old, which would have been 1957, in Shreveport, Louisiana, he was handed his own radio show. So he had a far-reaching voice now, a voice that reached out to, throughout the entire state of Louisiana for an audience, so that it was easy for him to segue into acting and stand up and getting out there, because he already had that built-in audience. So it started in childhood and continued to grow throughout his entire life. Like I said, he's never really suffered. So the pathos that there's that. So coming from a place of creativity, you have to have a certain level of pathos in order for your bit and for your work to really resonate with people. And that's what's missing with him. And I think that's my biggest criticism of him, is that a person who was born into privilege, who was able to amass, hundreds of thousands of dollars in his career, if not more, who was able to dupe a public who was suffering into paying him, $100 a ticket to go and perform at some of the most lavish theaters across the world. I mean, yes, he was saying the things that make us, really make us angry, but he's also, like, in the same way that Sane Progressive was, he's working on our emotions. And when you have somebody who is so concentrating on grabbing you emotionally, then what it does is it suspends your intellectual part of your brain. It suspends that, and you don't really think about who the person is that's delivering this emotional content. And the person delivering it, whether it's, Sane Progressive, who shot up to fame really quickly, so to speak, apparently, allegedly, throughout social media, or whether it was George Carlin, who was on the circuit before social media even existed. The fact is that these people don't come from that authentic place, but they know how to describe it really well, and it works for you. So if you also have never suffered, like, financially, like JP and I were not able to pay our utilities. We're talking, our income is less than $10,000 a year. We don't have the money to survive. So when we listen to people like Carlin or Sane Progressive, we go, yeah, we can't really relate, because we know their backstory. We know that they were given all sorts of opportunity, all sorts of meritocracy, all sorts of they were just handed everything that they could ever want or need in order to be a success. And that is not the case for the majority of Americans, especially in this generation, and especially in my generation, which is Generation X, the most scapegoated generation in history. That unless you're born into wealth, and unless your last name is Klein or Rockefeller or, Clinton or, Kennedy or, Barrymore, you know what I'm saying? Unless your last name is that, you are never, ever going to know what it's like to have that privilege and meritocracy handed to you. None of those people that I just mentioned have ever been hungry. None of those people have ever wondered if their electricity and their gas is going to get shut off because they couldn't afford to pay the bill, like we are right now. So let's not lift up people who aren't really authentic. Let's really try to focus on people who are coming from a place of authenticity, is my suggestion, and it's my criticism of that. And I'm not criticizing friends and people who really love and like George Carlin, I think ultimately towards the end of his career, as he moved more towards focusing on the very wealthy and focusing on the government and focusing on the real problems that have defined our society over the last 100 years, as he started focusing more on that, he started to redeem himself. But I have a feeling it was more about people are starting to get wise to me. They're realizing that I was just handed all this opportunity. I better like distract from that and start focusing on the real bad guys, because ultimately he's not the bad guy. He found his niche, he found his talent, and it was grown for him and invested in by outside influencers. And you can really tell though that there's that like dysfunctional attitude that comes from a dysfunctional relationship with your mother. You can really see that in his early work when he starts just going after everybody. He starts going after women who carry babies a certain way. He starts going after guys named Todd. I mean, it's this weird, like, I hate everybody because, mommy kind of stuff. And that has to do with that really sort of incestuous, controlling relationship that he himself admits that he had, especially the controlling part with his own mother. So, this is not somebody that I would typically like want to really lift up as like the expert on class warfare because of the level of dysfunction. It's the same thing with Jimmy Dore too. I mean, he comes from a really dysfunctional, abusive background in his life, which lends to his pathos, which gives him a little more credibility. But ultimately, he keeps talking about, voting for people. And that's where he loses me, when he keeps talking about candidates who are already millionaires or billionaires. It's like, why even talk about them? Why don't you talk about direct democracy or mutual aid? Why don't you talk about, like, the fact that there's maybe a guy who runs a barber shop in Anderson, Indiana, who's helping out his community. And why don't you just focus all of your energy and time and passion on somebody like that instead of somebody like Tulsi Gabbard, who's already wealthy and was already born into that meritocracy. Come on, bring it. We need to see more of that and less lifting up of the already wealthy. You're already rich. I don't have anything to say to you. So that's my criticism of Carlin, is that in researching his background and really looking into his how he grew up and everything that he was handed and all the opportunity that he was given. I mean, the dude had 3 heart surgeries in his lifetime. No middle class or even lower middle class American can have multiple surgeries. I mean, he was born with like a heart problem. If you're born with a heart problem in society today, then you're dead by the time you're 40. And that's just it. That's just all there is to it. He lived to be 70, 71 or 72 years old, had 3 heart surgeries. He had plenty of money his entire life. He never went hungry. He never really understood on a real level the imprisonment of being poor and the class divide. Not like I have. Not like I'm living right now. So it's difficult for me to lift him up as this great orator of, where he has all these great epiphanies about something that he's never really experienced.
Thank you for watching. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. If you really like our work, you can help support us on a regular basis by going to patreon.com/bookofhours. For as little as $2 a month, you can sustain us and keep us working. You can also make a one-time donation at paypal.me/bookofhours. Thank you.